For a brief moment, investigators thought they had their break, because extortion implied motive, and motive implied a person who could make mistakes. But that hope faded as quickly as it appeared. The letter led them to a man named James Lewis, a drifter with a criminal past, who had mailed the letter from New York. He was arrested, interrogated extensively, and ultimately convicted of extortion. But despite intense scrutiny, investigators could never place him in Chicago at the time of the poisonings. Nor could they tie him directly to the contaminated bottles. He was a parasite on tragedy, not necessarily its architect. As weeks passed without new deaths, fear slowly receded, but uncertainty remained, because no one could say whether the killer had stopped or simply disappeared, satisfied with the damage already done. The case grew colder, evidence aging, leads drying up, and investigators forced to confront the most unsettling outcome of all, that the person responsible might never be identified. Cold cases are often defined by what they lack, but this one was defined by what it left behind: a nation forever changed, a criminal justice system exposed as vulnerable, and families trapped in a permanent moment between ordinary life and unimaginable loss. For the victims' families, grief unfolded privately and relentlessly. Parents replayed final moments endlessly. Siblings wondered if they could have done something differently. And the randomness of the deaths made healing difficult, because there was no narrative of risk, no warning sign to explain what had happened. These were not victims who had placed themselves in danger. They had trusted the same routines that millions of others trusted every day. That truth made the crime feel personal to everyone, because it suggested that safety was not earned, only assumed, and assumptions could be fatal. Years passed. Leads were re-examined. New forensic techniques were applied to old evidence. The FBI periodically announced renewed efforts, releasing age-progressed profiles, reconsidering suspects, and reviewing theories. But the core mystery remained untouched. Some investigators believed the killer lived locally and blended back into anonymity. Others suspected someone who left the area entirely, carrying the knowledge of what they had done like a private secret. The possibility that the person responsible might have died without ever being held accountable haunted everyone involved. A reminder that justice does not always arrive. No matter how visible the crime, what endured most powerfully was the legacy. Tampered-evident packaging became mandatory. Capsules were redesigned. Safety seals became symbols of reassurance rather than marketing. Consumers learned to inspect before trusting, to pause before swallowing. And though decades have passed, echoes of that fear still surface whenever recalls are announced or products are questioned. The Tylenol murders did not just kill 7 people. They killed innocence. The belief that danger always looks dangerous, and replaced it with a quieter, more permanent awareness that harm can hide in plain sight. And somewhere, perhaps the person who caused it all moved through life unnoticed, watching the changes ripple outward, knowing that they had rewritten the rules without ever stepping into the light. Leaving behind a crime scene not confined to a single street or building, but stretched across an entire nation, sealed not with blood, but with trust broken so deeply it could never be fully repaired. As the years stretched on, the Tylenol murders settled into an uneasy place between memory and myth, a case so infamous that everyone seemed to know it, yet no one truly understood it, because the absence of a named killer left a void that facts alone could not fill. Investigators who had worked the case aged, retired, and passed their notes to younger agents who inherited not just boxes of evidence but the weight of failure. The knowledge that 7 people had died and no one had been held fully accountable. Every few years a new task force would quietly reopen the files, convinced that modern science or fresh eyes might finally expose what had been missed. But the case resisted resolution with stubborn silence. One of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation was the lack of a clear psychological signature. Unlike many serial crimes, there was no escalation, no taunting follow-up, no public confession, and no obvious attempt to gain lasting recognition. The killer struck, caused nationwide panic, and then vanished. Profilers debated whether this indicated a highly disciplined individual who knew when to stop, or someone who panicked once the scale of the response exceeded expectations. Some believed the poisonings were an experiment, a test of how easily chaos could be introduced into everyday life. While others argued that the motive was deeply personal, perhaps rooted in resentment toward corporate power, institutions, or society itself. James Lewis continued to cast a long shadow over the case. Though never charged with the murders, his extortion letter placed him permanently in the public imagination as a possible culprit. Investigators revisited his movements repeatedly, re-examining timelines, addresses, and acquaintances, searching for a missed connection that could tie him physically to Chicago during the poisonings. Yet every time, the evidence fell short. He was manipulative, opportunistic, and clearly willing to exploit tragedy for personal gain. But proving that he had actually poisoned the capsules remained impossible. The law demands certainty, and suspicion alone could not close the case. Other suspects surfaced briefly over the years, often triggered by confessions that unraveled under scrutiny or tips from individuals seeking attention. A chemist fascinated by toxins, a disgruntled employee with access to stores, a recluse known for anti-corporate beliefs. Each theory brought a surge of hope, followed by disappointment. The challenge was not imagining who could have done it, but proving who did. Because the killer had chosen a method that left almost nothing behind, no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses who saw anything more suspicious than an ordinary scalper returning an item to a shelf. What troubled investigators most was how simple the crime had been. No forced entry, no confrontation, no struggle. Just the quiet act of tampering with capsules, resealing bottles, and walking away. That simplicity exposed a vulnerability in modern society. The assumption that systems designed for convenience could also guarantee safety. The killer exploited that assumption perfectly, demonstrating that trust itself could be weaponized. And that realization reshaped how law enforcement approached threats in the decades that followed. For the families, time did not dull the loss, it only changed its shape. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays became reminders. Parents who had once fought for answers grew older, some dying without ever knowing who had taken their children. They attended memorials, gave interviews, and cooperated with investigators whenever asked, holding on to the fragile hope that someday a knock on the door would bring clarity, if not peace. Their grief became part of the case's legacy, a reminder that unsolved crimes do not end when headlines fade. They linger quietly in living rooms and empty bedrooms. The media continued to revisit the story, especially on anniversaries, framing it as a mystery, a cautionary tale, or a symbol of lost innocence. Each retelling brought the case to new generations, who could hardly imagine a time before safety seals and tamper-proof packaging, before warnings printed in bold letters, before the idea that medicine itself could be dangerous. In this way, the killer achieved something few criminals ever do: a lasting, systemic impact that outlived the crime itself. Despite advancements in forensic science, including DNA profiling and chemical tracing, the Tylenol murders remained stubbornly out of reach. There was simply nothing left to test. No preserved biological evidence, no traceable contamination point, no definitive suspect whose belongings could be re-examined with new tools. The case became a lesson in the limits of technology, proof that even in an age of innovation, some crimes slip through history untouched. And yet the question refused to die. Who would do this? Why stop? How did they live with it? Investigators speculated that the killer may have lived an unremarkable life afterward, blending back into routine, carrying the knowledge quietly, perhaps watching the news coverage with interest, perhaps never speaking of it again. That possibility disturbed people more than the idea of a monster hiding in the shadows, because it suggested that someone capable of such devastation could also be capable of appearing completely normal. In the end, the Tylenol murders remain one of America's most chilling crime scenes, not because of bloodshed or brutality, but because of restraint, anonymity, and silence. They exposed the fragility of trust, the ease with which everyday systems can be exploited, and the haunting reality that some crimes leave behind no villain to punish, only a permanent shift in how the world works. The bottles were recalled, the seals redesigned, the warnings added. But the absence of answers endures, a quiet reminder that justice does not always arrive, and some questions echo forever unanswered. In the spaces between routine and fear,